Welcome, everyone, to Cecilia Wiesner's senior oration. Just a few words of introduction. Cece came to me a year ago now with a question, a burning question that she had, which was, what is poverty of spirit? What does it really mean? This ended up opening out onto a host of other questions as well. For example, okay, I know that monks and nuns are called to poverty, material poverty, but what about the rest of us? Are we just called to this poverty of spirit, which really just means I'm detached from my Maserati? Nebulous way. She asked, is there some kind of universal call to poverty akin to the universal call to holiness, to which all of us are called? Or likewise, even if we grant that perhaps it's permissible to be wealthy as a Christian, is it good? Is it something we should desire or seek out? In the course of working on her thesis, Cece really delved deeply and widely also in this topic. She delved deeply into church teaching, and then she also she had conversations with Byzantine nuns in Ohio about their own call to poverty. She read works from a Japanese cleaning consultant, minimalist, to gain a kind of secular understanding of simple living, I guess. It's actually fascinating to read that, but she'll have something to say about that as we go. She did a lot of work to make this thesis really come together and to bring about a real synthesis of these ideas in the course of her thesis. And so it is a real pleasure for me to introduce to you Miss Cecilia Wiesner, who will be speaking, giving her oration under the title of "Living Life with an Open Hand: The Universal Christian Call to Poverty." Join me.
Being just as invested in this, if not perhaps more invested in this topic than I have been. It's been a true pleasure working with you this whole year. Thank you, Dr. Olson, for being a panelist here, and Dr. Bowen for being my second reader. Let's begin in prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Spirit. Lord, high and holy, meek and lowly, thou hast brought me to the valley of vision, where I live in the depths, but see thee in the heights. Hemmed in by mountains of sin, I behold thy glory. Let me learn by paradox that the way down is the way up, that to be low is to be high, that the broken heart is the healed heart, that the contrite spirit is the rejoicing spirit, the repenting soul is the victorious soul, that to have nothing is to possess all, that to bear the cross is to wear the crown, that to give is to receive, that the valley is the place of vision. Lord, in the daytime, stars can be seen from deepest wells, and the deeper the wells, the brighter thy stars shine. Let me find thy light in my darkness, thy life in my death, thy joy in my sorrow, thy grace in my sin, thy riches in my poverty, thy glory in my valley. Saint Teresa of Calcutta. When I was 18, I was given the unexpected opportunity to live and study in France. My stay lasted 9 months, but I was limited to only 2 suitcases. I had no idea how to leave behind so many things that I was so attached to. And my attachment to my possessions made my packing process embarrassingly difficult. what I would soon realize is that I wouldn't even use everything I brought with me, nor would I miss what I left behind. The French live very simple lifestyles, and I soon adopted their way of life, and was amazed to find how freeing it was. This freedom of living with less baffled me. Then, upon encountering the curriculum here, I realized it was not a new discovery, but something that has been proclaimed for a very long time. Ancient thinkers such as Marcus Aurelius and Solon and Lycurgus all proclaim the importance of intentionally living simple and austere lifestyles. They say that it's beneficial both personally and politically. This ancient thought has reached modern ears as well, as Dr. Judd mentioned. Marie Kondo proclaims the life-changing magic of living with less. So, what is it about living with less that is so good for us? Well, the church in her wealth has had her answer to this question for a very long time. Beneath the skin of the easily digested phrase, simple living, runs its intimidating and powerful blood. The truth of gospel poverty, called poverty of spirit in the Beatitudes. We often tend to wave off this call to poverty as something specific only to the consecrated religious or to those extreme ascetic saints, such as St. Mary of Egypt or St. Anthony of the Desert, who lived miraculously sustained for decades. Or if we do embrace some kind of poverty for ourselves, we embrace a form of detachment, again, as Dr. Judd said earlier, without really considering what this detachment means. And so here I am today to challenge any passive or potentially watered down versions of our radical and universal call to poverty. Poverty of spirit is something that Christ asked us to tangibly live out. And the long-standing tradition of simple living serves as a means to practicing poverty of spirit. In order to best go about arguing this, I've broken my oration into two major parts. In the first part, I will be demonstrating the church's tradition of poverty of spirit and illustrating just how essential it is that all Christians adopt a spirit of poverty in order to have a deeper relationship with God. And in the second part, I will illustrate why and how we ought to live out this poverty of spirit, and that it is precisely through living it out that we obtain a spirit of poverty. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of God. Well, you are all probably familiar with this phrase, or this passage from Scripture. It still might not have the clearest of meanings. And so, like a good liberal arts student, I get to make some definitions. When I say poverty of spirit, I do not mean a kind of separation from God or a state of spiritual desolation. We see this exemplified in the character Raskolnikov from Crime and Punishment. He intentionally separates himself from all his relationships and lives in his own world. This is an example of what we call spiritual destitution. In order to best define what poverty of spirit is, I will turn to Johannes Baptist Metz, who wrote a book called Poverty of Spirit. According to Metz, poverty of spirit is an inherent human condition of emptiness, brokenness, and weakness that infiltrates all of human existence. As spiritual and physical beings, souls tied up in immortal souls wrapped up in mortal bodies, we are inherently at odds with ourselves. Any kind of suffering like this that is particular to humanity, Metz calls our inherent poverty. And according to Metz, it is only in a complete embrace of this inherent poverty that we can become fully human. And that God can come and fill all of our deficiencies with his life-giving love. This harkens back to St. Paul's, "When I am weak, then I am strong." As Christians, we strive to live our lives with Christ as our primary example for how to live. cheesy as it may be, the simple phrase, "What would Jesus do?" is actually an extremely important question to be asking ourselves every single day. And the first and most critical thing that Jesus did was to become incarnate. Now, it might seem weird at first to say that we humans have any need to incarnate ourselves, but according to Metz, becoming human is our primary mandate and mission. And the only way in which to become fully human is to embrace our inherent poverty. This very dynamic is exemplified in Christ's incarnation. In becoming human, he took upon himself all of our weakest and lowest places and united them to his all-powerful divinity. And he did this so that we might be made gods, as St. Athanasius says. The second way in which Christ illustrated that our poverty is a fundamental part of our humanity is in the way in which he became human. He could have been anyone he wanted because he's God, but he chose to come as a vulnerable baby born to a simple woman in a small, crowded stable, or a cave if you're Byzantine. Before starting his ministry, Christ was a simple carpenter. And after starting his ministry, he lived nomadically and humbly, choosing to surround himself with the smelly fishermen and the societal outcasts of his time. And finally, in his greatest moment of poverty, which stands as the most crucial, completely and utterly outpoured himself on the cross. Metz says, in quote number 1, quote, "The legacy of God's total commitment to humankind, the proof of God's fidelity to our poverty, is the cross. The cross is the sacrament of poverty of spirit, the sacrament of authentic humanness in a sinful world. It is the sign that one human being remained true to his own humanity, that he accepted it in full obedience." End quote. From this full obedience springs the fullness that is the life of the resurrected body. Only in Christ's death unto himself is life brought into the world. And this applies to us as well. Even Jesus himself said, this is quote number 2, "Truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. He who loves his life loses it, and he who hates his life in this world will keep it for eternal life." End quote. To embrace none of this paradox makes sense unless Christ comes in to fill all of the emptiness. To embrace our inherent poverty, to embrace Christ as our wealth. Mother Cecilia, a dear friend and a nun at the Byzantine monastery called Christ the Bridegroom Monastery in Burton, Ohio, has a special devotion to poverty of spirit. When I asked her how she defined it, she gave me way too many answers to put here, but my 2 favorite were as follows. She said first that she used to think of herself in her poverty as something broken and shattered, with all sorts of empty and vacuous places. And that God would come and from the outside put her all back together, nice and new. But what she's realized is that rather than an external reparation, Christ enters into those vacuous places to make her whole. And it is only when those vacuous and worthless places are cleared out of other debris that Christ can come in and fill her with his life-giving love. Her second example is printed for you on your quote sheet. Quote number 3. She says, "I see spiritual poverty as a spiritual womb. It is an empty place where God comes to dwell and bring forth divine life. A stream of water on earth flows to the lowest place, and God's love is a torrent of water that flows to the lowest places in us." This was the quote sheet. natural result of our full embrace of our spiritual poverty is a better understanding of our self-worth before God. As it stands, as a culture, we hold a very Hobbesian view of the human's inherent value. And this is what Thomas Hobbes thinks of the human's worth. Quote number 4. Quote, "The value or worth of a man is, as of all other things, his price. That is to say, so much as would be given for the use of his power. And therefore it is not absolute, but a thing dependent on the need and judgment of another. A human's value is no more than it is esteemed by others." End quote. While we might not be fully aware of just how deeply we believe that our worth corresponds to a numerical price tag, Christ was aware of this. And this is why his message is good news to the poor. His message is that we do not need to be rich or powerful in order to be worthy of his love. On the contrary, we need to become poor for him. A correct placement of our self-worth was what Christ desired for his disciples when he told them the story of the lilies of the field and the birds of the air. He pointed out to them that the lilies and the birds, while a part of creation, didn't have to work in order to be provided for. And then he asks his disciples, "Are you not of more value than they?" And of course we are of more value than the birds of the air and the lilies of the field. We are made in Christ's very image and likeness. And so he says, "Do not be anxious about tomorrow, for tomorrow will be anxious for itself. Let the day's own trouble be sufficient for the day." It is also essential to note that this complete and wholehearted embrace of our inherent poverty must have its foundation in prayer. Both Metz and Mother Teresa say very similar things about this. Metz says in quote number 6, "Only prayer reveals the precipitous depths of our poverty. Submission to it involves an awareness. In prayer, we drink the dregs of our poverty, the richness and grandeur of someone else, God." And Mother Teresa says practically the same thing, but classic Mother Teresa style in much simpler terms. She says, "Prayer gives us a pure heart. It purifies our heart. And a pure heart can see God." So, as I conclude the first part of my oration, I hope to leave you with the understanding that our inherent poverty, brokenness, and our weakness is not something to be ashamed of, but rather something to embrace, akin to a gift. In embracing our poverty, it allows God to fill us with his life. In fully accepting that we are from dirt, and to dirt we shall return, this allows God to make that dirt his fertile soil for his life. By embracing a spirit of poverty, we become a spiritual womb, a place where God comes to dwell and bring forth his divine life, as Mother Cecilia said. Now, as beautiful as this whole poverty of spirit tradition is, I don't want its poetic beauty to distract you from an extremely important point, which is that if poverty of spirit is supposed to create room for God to come and fill us with his divine life, it's necessarily something that needs to be lived out. And it is precisely through living it out externally that we learn to embrace it internally. So this brings me nicely to the second part of my oration. And yet again, like a good liberal arts student, I get to draw some distinctions. When I say poverty lived out, I do not mean the kind of poverty that we see with Mother Teresa's Poorest of the Poor in Calcutta, or with those struggling to survive on the streets of Denver that the Christ in the City missionaries serve. This is an involuntary form of poverty, which I call destitution. This is the poverty of Lazarus, who sits at the gate of the rich man. So weak, he is unable to fend off the dogs, who lick his wounds and make his sores even worse. This is the kind of poverty that we are called to serve. Dorothy Day makes a similar distinction in her essay, Poverty and Destitution. This is quote number 9. There is involuntary poverty and voluntary poverty. And all of us who try to earn a living by writing experience voluntary poverty. Or teaching. And there is, of course, the holy poverty of those who try daily to strip themselves of all attachments and to approximate to some extent the physical condition of the destitute. The destitute, on the other hand, have nothing, physically, intellectually, or spiritually. You never see them reading a book or a newspaper as they wait in the bread line, or listening to music, or playing with an alley cat as they sit on a curb in the sun, or laughing or telling stories. So the poverty of the destitute is the kind of poverty that we are called to serve. Whereas the voluntary poverty spoken of here by Dorothy Day is the kind of poverty we are to aspire to. And this aspiration is drawn directly from the scriptures. In the Gospel of Matthew, a rich young man approaches Christ and asks him, "What good deed must I do to have eternal life?" Christ's response, "Go, sell all that you have and give to the poor," is an extremely intimidating message. But it was Christ's requirement before the rich young man could enter or could have eternal life and follow him. The rich young man could not handle this, and instead of doing what Jesus asked, he went away sorrowful, for he had great possessions. I want you all to honestly ask yourselves, if Jesus were to appear to you today and ask you to go through every single possession in your house or in your dorm room and sell every possession and give that money away to the poor and follow him with nothing but the clothes on your back, would this make you a little sad? It would make me sad too. I like my stuff. But this is evidence of our capacity as humans to place our worldly possessions at a higher esteem than our relationship with God. And this is why it's easier for the camel to pass through the eye of the needle than for the rich man to enter the kingdom of God. The reason that we get so attached to our things is because, in a way, our possessions are extensions of ourselves. So I'll explain this a little. Because we have the capacity to extend our imagination and our sensation through other objects and use them for our purposes, we have, in a way, the capacity to extend ourselves through them. And so when we use other things, we raise them to a higher level of being, in a sense, because they participate in human activity. This is part of why it's so hard to give up our things, because it's deeply akin to cutting off a limb or plucking out an eye. It's painful and unnatural, but we have to do it if it's cutting us off from a relationship with God. And our physical possessions have the capacity to cut us off from a relationship with God. Just in our nature as physical beings, we are reliant on physical things. And so it's easy for us to misplace where our life source really comes from. Like, I could really think that I'm more reliant on this than I am on God because I do need water. But technically, God could miraculously sustain me. So really, he is our full source of life. The bright side of this is of our possessions being extensions of ourselves is that in giving up our things to other people, we're in a sense giving ourselves to them, which is a way of laying down our lives for them. So by giving up our things, we're actually tangibly teaching ourselves how to have a greater reliance in God's providence and deeper faith with God. Because we are spiritual and physical beings, our internal states and our external states reciprocally affect each other. And so, if we want to obtain a spirit of poverty, it makes the most sense to practice it externally. Aristotle, whose Nicomachean Ethics rests on the idea that man strive for virtue, a habit of the soul, in order to obtain happiness, would likely agree with me. He says, in quote 10, virtues come into being by engaging in the activities first. For as regards those things we must learn how to do, we learn by doing them. So if we want to learn the internal state of poverty and obtain it as a habit of the soul, it makes the most sense to practice it externally. And this experiential habit of poverty teaches us our internal poverty and allows us to have a better relationship with God. Mother Teresa of Calcutta very well understood the importance of both embracing a spirit of poverty and living it out, not only for herself, but also for the sake of the destitute that she served. She says in quote number 11, in order to understand the poor, we ourselves must live the life of the poor. Dorothy Day, who is a servant of God and lived her entire life serving and fighting for the rights of the poor, says something similar in her article, More About Holy Poverty, which is voluntary poverty. Quote 12. She says, we must keep on talking about voluntary poverty and holy poverty, because it is only if we can consent to strip ourselves that we can put on Christ. It is only if we love poverty that we are going to have the means to help others. If we love poverty, we will be free to give up a job, to speak when we feel it would be wrong to be silent. We can only talk about voluntary poverty because we believe Christians must be fools for Christ. We can only embrace voluntary poverty in the light of faith. Both of these women, Mother Teresa and Dorothy Day, exemplify a natural consequence of a complete embrace of a lifestyle of poverty of spirit. They were both extremely generous to those around them and always serving. They took to heart one of the most simultaneously intimidating and hopeful passages of Scripture in the Gospel of Matthew. Quote 13. Come, O blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to me. Truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these my brethren, you did it to me. Mother Teresa often would say that Christ was most encounterable in two major ways. The first one is obviously through the Eucharist. We encounter his real body under the accidents of bread and wine. And the second was through the poor. She used to say that all of Christ's teaching could be summarized in the 5 words, you did it to me. So, poverty is not just an internal call. It is something that we are called to live out with regards to our possessions and to the destitute around us. In giving away our things, especially to those in greater need, we are giving ourselves and we are loving them. And through loving others, we love him. You did it to me. When we give away our possessions, we expose to ourselves our attachments. This teaches us generosity because it teaches us a greater reliance in God's providence. This is how we become poor. This is how we fulfill our mandate and mission. At this point, I would like to return to a question that I raised at the beginning of my oration. How is it that a rejection of the material goods, when God's creation is so good and so beautiful, how is it that that can actually be better for us? Karen Blixen, in her short story Babette's Feast, addresses this question well. The story takes place in a small, very puritanical society of a community who has decided to take on voluntary poverty very strictly. While they do much good for the poor, they also live in an intense fear of all material goods. Babette, a former and very famous chef from Paris, incidentally arrives needy and alone at the doorstep of two women from this community. She joins them in their lifestyle, and soon, and nobody ever learns about her past. One day, she wins 10,000 francs in the lottery. And instead of using this money to return to a luxurious lifestyle in France, she turns around and spends it all on one of the most abundant and luxurious feasts you could imagine. She wants to give back to the community that has served her so generously for so many years. And these simple folk are absolutely scandalized and afraid at first by this feast. But soon, the wine and the food gladden their hearts, and they're able to see, as if through a window, a small glimpse of the reality of heaven. This is quote 14. The vain illusions of this earth had dissolved before their eyes like smoke, and they had seen the universe as it really is. They had been given 1 hour of the millennium. This story teaches us two things about poverty. The first is that when it is taken to too literal or too scrupulous of an extent, it can actually become an idol in itself, and it can cut us off from any receptivity to God's generosity. Secondly, and paradoxically, it shows the relationship between a voluntary lifestyle of poverty and a greater freedom to generosity. Babette could have used her money on herself, but instead, she poured it out on people who had never felt its good benefits or its good effects. So, before I conclude, I'd like to walk back through what I've said so far. I began by defining poverty of spirit and pointing out that it's a fundamental factor in our relationship with God. It teaches us our utter reliance on Him, and thus teaches us our relationship to Him as His utterly dependent and beloved children. Christ said, "Unless you become like little children, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven." Secondly, I said that this internal state of poverty is something that must be lived out, and that in living it out, we learn to embrace it internally. This external habit of poverty teaches us to obtain poverty of spirit as a habit of the soul. This was Christ's invitation to the rich young man, and it's His invitation to all of us today. The result of embracing our poverty, internally and externally, is that it teaches us God's abundant generosity. Once we've learned this, we can move with greater freedom to give with mirrored generosity to those around us. This is one tangible way to love others as He loved us. And in loving others, we love Him. You did it to me. God asks everything of us. But in return, He gives everything back. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Thank you.
Thank you, Ceclia. We'll start with a few questions here from the panel, and then we'll open it up to the audience as well.
Thank you. So, WWJD. I've not really thought about that much seriously. I think I had a bracelet when I was a kid. Feels kind of trite, kind of facile, I guess. There's obviously good instinct there. I'm trying to articulate what it is, maybe what are some problems. And it seems like one problem with asking what would Jesus do is that I'm not Jesus. So for example, He wouldn't be married to my wife. But I should keep being married to my wife. So it makes it seem kind of kind of simple. The difference is him somehow in our own lives, right? He calls this one man to go give away all of his possessions, but he didn't just go around and say it to everyone. Not in the same way. It seems like that was a particular, or did he? I guess. So maybe two questions: was that a particular? I mean, my reading that I guess has always been Jesus knew something that man needed that not every man needed, you know, and that's certainly there's something there, right? But so how particular is that call, I guess? And then can you say something about how we ought to make a judgment about how this plays out in an individual's life? I guess.
Yeah, so as regards to the particularity of the call, it for sure is not the case that every single person is called to live such extreme poverty. But because we've seen many examples of saints who live out sanctity perfectly well with varying levels of wealth or possessions. But I do think that the particularity, it is particular to everyone in as much as we ought to be ready to answer that call. Which is actually why I titled my oration, Living Life with an Open Hand. If we are always living in this state of holding our things, our relationships, our possessions, our status in social society, whatever, if we're holding them with open hands, we're supporting them. It's not like we're just like, all right, I don't need to be married anymore because God calls me to be poor. Like, we're not rejecting our responsibilities. We're holding them, feeling their weight, but we're also ready for God to take them away if he so desires. And always acknowledging that this is a position of reception, that we've received what we have from him as a gift. So it's not so much that we're all called to literally sell all of our possessions and give them away to the poor, but some people were. It's that we're called to always be ready to respond to that call. Does that make sense? Okay. And then as far as the what would Jesus do idea, I think the best way to go about this, practically speaking, is to look at the lives of the saints. Because while they aren't Jesus, they have a closer relationship with him than we do. And we can learn through their knowledge of how to act the way he acts. And of course, that because of the universal church, there's so much diversity. So it's always going to come down to a question of fits, but the readiness, the radical readiness to give all we have and follow Christ is what we're called to.
Thank you, Cece. Never felt better about my finances. I'd like to follow it up. I'm not entirely sure I understand what you mean by be ready to. Is just a kind of detachment? Is it actually what you're describing actually compatible with Dr. Joe's kind of facetious introductory remark? I could actually not be that attached to my Maserati. What does it mean to be ready to, and how do I know if I'm called to give up everything?
Yeah, so I think the difficulty with detachment in general is that we rely too much on detachment as an abstract concept. Then it's easy for us to convince ourselves that we are detached from things that we own, but not ever really know. And so, in terms of having an expensive car, I don't really know. I've never had one, but you won't know if you're detached from your things unless you try to give them up. Like, how are we supposed to know what our attachments are unless we're willing to practice giving them away? And even if it's not out of someone else's need, even if it's just, this might be excessive. Do I really need this? Maybe I shouldn't have it. And expose to yourself what your attachments are. But we won't know until we try actually detaching ourselves from them. Does that make sense?
I'm not sure. So we have to try it. So we actually do have to give everything for a while. I'm trying to see what this looks like concretely.
I know, and that's the first question everyone has, and it's the most difficult question because it's a question of prudence. Like, as the man would know. But
Maybe if I give an example, this makes me think of a conversation that happened back when I was a grad student, where someone was arguing that if we something along these lines, if we really had trust in divine providence and were willing to embrace poverty, anytime we had any excess money left over at the end of the month from our needs, we would donate to charity.
mhm.
And there was a debate about whether that was a good idea. How do you think that idea fits with what you're saying?
I mean,
So it should never be saving money. In other words, it's just be spending what I need and giving the rest away.
I have two answers, and one of them is a cop-out answer, so I'm going to start with that one. Mother Teresa, when having a conversation with one of her priests, one of her missionaries, he was trying to convince her to live more economically, to get cell phones for the nuns, because it would save them time and money and energy, whatever. And then she says to him, I have a vow of poverty, not a vow of economics. And I just thought that was really profound, because it's not so much about economics. Like, we see plenty of saints who are wealthy and live out their vocation in wealth well, like Thomas More. In terms of the particular of like, how much money do I give away? I really do think it depends on what level of radical trust you're going to place in God. Like, if you feel like you are too attached to your money or you're too reliant on it for your sense of stability, then it might be good for you to practice giving it for a while. And yeah, like it might be a flux thing where for some periods of your life you go through more severe states of asceticism, and through other states of life you have different levels of asceticism because different responsibilities arise. Like, it would not be prudent of you to leave your whole family and quit your job. Like, don't do that. You know? You have your vocation, and Mother Teresa was also really clear about different people having different strengths that she didn't have, and her having strengths that they didn't have, and that like there is this dynamic of this balance that works out with all different levels of vocations and different things that we're called to. But yeah, I don't know. I think that if you wanted to test your level of faith in God's providence, you could give up some of your excess money or all of it. I know when I lived in France, actually, my host family, during Lent, that's what we did. With any excess money, we donated to the poor. We also didn't buy any bread all the time. We just reduced the really stale, hard bread. And it was a small thing, and it was only for 40 days, but it was an opportunity to practice this just like reliance on God's providence.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you, Cece. Maybe a sort of follow-up question on two colleagues' questions. You touched on the idea that poverty of spirit is in some sense a kind of virtue. I wonder if you could sort of expand on that a little bit more. Maybe perhaps in light of Dr. Boland's question of saying how do you know if you have poverty of spirit? Seems to me that might be somewhat akin to asking that same question about any other virtue. How do I know that I have the virtue of courage, for example, or prudence, or things of this sort? Could you maybe expand a little bit on how poverty of spirit is a kind of virtue?
Yeah, so with your examples of courage or prudence, obviously with courage, you don't know if you are courageous until you do something that you're afraid of. Like, you have to test it out. You have to go do the thing that you're afraid of in order to develop this virtue of courage. And yeah, I think it applies in the same way with poverty. We don't know that we're poor in spirit unless we practice it and really test ourselves and challenge ourselves. Like, it's a pretty difficult and radical thing to be doing, but every single day kind of evaluating what can I do to reveal to myself my attachments? How can I rely more on God instead of my attachments? Yeah. So, and then giving up something even that you think that you need, that actually creates a space for God to come and fill that need. Again, like, you can't do it with everything because we have different responsibilities, and it takes prudence and prayer. But we don't know until we practice.
Yeah, that's helpful. I almost feel like you could even go further with that in saying, by thinking about the virtues or different habits that a person might possess, it'd be even more than just saying you don't know whether you have it until you practice it, but also you can't really possess it without doing it. And what I mean, an example would be something like, say, a physical virtue or physical habit. Right? If you go to the gym and you're lifting weights for a long time, right? You're strong only so long as you continue to do that over time, right? If you stop going to the gym, okay, maybe you'll be strong for a little while. All right, well, I got strong, so now I'm strong, and now I never have to.
Right. Like when I was 18, I had the opportunity to just be like, okay, I'm attached to these things and I have time. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm still detached from those things. Like I might have a regained attachment. Is that what you're saying? Like it's something we need to be habitually practicing constantly, not just for one day. God, yes.
Yeah. That seems right. I would expect that would be the case for religious also, who granted, they enter the monastery or the convent and they give away all their physical possessions, all their worldly goods. But that doesn't mean that okay, well, great, now the rest of my life I have a spirit of poverty necessarily. It seems like it would need to be continually practiced in whatever ways that might look like.
Mm-hmm. And the nuns, when I spoke to them over the summer, they all agreed that was the case. That actually, in a lot of ways, giving it the physical things was not the hardest part. It was kind of the first step. And it is a hard first step, but there's more to it than that. Like it continues beyond just our physical things into our emotional attachments or even our intellectual attachments and things like that. So yeah,
Okay,
it's
thank you.
lifelong.
Other questions from the panel before we open it up? Great. We'll let Cecily call on folks from the audience.
That's beautiful. What I'm wondering is from the image of living with an open hand. What I think of, what I'm wondering from our conversation and your thesis in general, is that when like a child is holding something, like Judah Karlstrom has a knife. To get it from him. I can say, I'm so sorry. I can say like, Judah, give me the knife, and then pull it out of his hands, right? Or I can try to hand him something else. And I'm like, if I just like, I'm like, I have a kitten for you. And I'm wondering, is everyone learn poverty of spirit on purpose? Like, is there a way that it can sneak up on you from behind? That you fall in love with having something, with grasping something like fall in love with something else and just like drop what you're holding. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think that's true. That's a huge part of the posture of open hand. Like, if you're grasping, it's painful and even dangerous to sometimes, depending on what you're grasping onto, to have it taken away. But if your hands are open, or like if there's something else that opens your hand, yeah, no, that's a good question. I hadn't thought about that before. I'm trying to think of an example. I mean, I wonder if actually Babette is a good example for this, because she obviously had great fame and wealth, status as a very famous chef in Paris, and then because of circumstances out of her control, ended up very poor and needy, and had to submit very humbly to the lifestyle of these Puritans, but she actually learned from them something really beautiful about the way that they were living, which is like this generosity. And then through her years of, like initially it was probably extremely uncomfortable, and she dealt with it humbly, but it took years before she won this lottery, and then at that point she was able to just like give it back to them instead of using it herself. So yeah.
I just want to hear a little bit more about like attachment, or I guess just like poverty and freedom, because I think it seems like there's a lot more there than just like, right, just a detachment from my material goods that I can give my material goods. But I'm just thinking about different scripture passages like leave your father and mother, or like Peter, like leave your boat, leave your job. So I just want to hear a little bit more about poverty and freedom.
Mm-hmm. So I think my most tangible experiences of this have been obviously the example I used of going to France, but also backpacking, which a lot of us here have experienced. There's something so empowering about living for 3 weeks with nothing but like the 3 pairs of underwear that you need for 3 weeks, like it's really kind of crazy minimalism that we put ourselves under. But it's so freeing. And I remember being able to focus so much more on the people around me and on what was really going on in me and not just like my stuff. As far as the attachment to like family or jobs or prior religious practices goes, it's a lot harder, right? Like, how can it be good to be kind of family? But I think it's again, those people who are called to that, we're called to a very radical form of abandonment to God's providence. And he did provide for them. And we don't know all the ins and outs of what that looked like for those individuals, but he promises to take care of us, He knows our needs, and he will meet them. So, I don't know, does that answer your question? Dr. Virginia.
Well, I'm very worried after your talk.
Yeah.
Because all these students who are your classmates are going to go out and take on the spirit of poverty, and we will never have any donations. It was quite interesting. But, the figures that I think of who embody the spirit of poverty, of course, we have these recent ones that you've mentioned, like Dorothy Day and Mother Teresa of Calcutta. But St. Francis, of course, the Franciscan spirit is the epitome of this. And when you think of him next to Dorothy Day and Mother Teresa, you think of people who not only embrace the spirit of poverty, but had an epic reason for doing so. They seem to have an action in the world that calls them to that spareness of spirit and things, which is a little bit different than this personal reflection that you're inviting us to do, using somebody like Maria Kondo, who I could never follow, because I have a really hard time picking up something I really love and saying, you've served me really well now, I'm going to give you away, that kind of thing. It doesn't have any form to it that has to do with not a lifestyle, but a way of life that is a calling. All these figures that are the saintly ones have an epic mission, which seems to be enfolded in the idea of the spirit of poverty and prior almost to it. And so I wonder if you have a cart before the horse and a horse before the cart, however that goes, putting the spirit of poverty as that thing that calls you, but it may be something else that calls you to it, which requires the spirit of poverty.
Similarly
what I'm
to
saying?
that question.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
No, yeah, I think that's very true. It's easiest to use radical examples because they just lived it out so extremely that it's so visible. I don't know. I think a good example is, sorry, I guess I'm not actually super clear on what your question is.
Well, think about Ike McCaslin in Go
Oh,
Down
okay.
Moses.
Yeah, no. Thank you. I actually did want to bring him up. I just wasn't exactly sure how to type it. So Ike McCaslin in Doctors for Moses, for any of you who don't know, is hunting a bear. And he, at one point, is a very elusive bear. And at one point, he knows he's on the tracks and realizes that he, for some reason, he has this instinctual understanding. He needs to get rid of his compass and his gun and his watch. And I think there's maybe something else, I can't remember what it is, but all of his tools that are designed to help him find the bear. And only once he's gotten rid of those things, does he see the bear. And of course he's useless, he can't shoot the bear or anything, but he gets to see it. And so I don't know, is that an example of it's definitely an epic in a sense, but it's only him and the bear. It's not like a grand public display or something.
Well, the giving up of his land because it's saturated with the blood and incestuous
and that would be
relationships
his
with the
grand, his epic.
Yeah. or Dorothy Day is a Marxist and then sees that that's the wrong path.
Yeah, she was just radical
Yes.
all around. She just went straight.
And then she sees, it's interesting to think about the calling that precedes the adoption of the spirit of poverty.
But I actually would like to say that I think Marie Kondo, while her method might seem superficial or something, I think she actually was getting at something very true, even if she doesn't have the fullness of the truth. Like, she understood that her attachments weighed her down a lot, and that they were making her unhappy. And so her whole method of picking up an object and whether or not it sparks joy, and that as you do this more and more, you develop a better sense of what it is that sparks joy. Often concludes in realizing what your priorities are. Like, it still exposes to you what your priorities are. So even if you're not Catholic or wanting a spirit of poverty in so many, there's a way in which you can achieve like the natural virtue of poverty.
Thank
you. John.
The natural.
Oh no, I should have said that.
No, I was going to ask this question as soon as you said Aristotle agreed with you, because it's a question that I've had like for the last 2.5 years since we did ethics with Dr. Papadopoulos. Like, it's not in Aristotle's litany of virtues, right? Like, is it completely contrary to the idea of magnanimity? You know, like.
You should go to Nathan's.
Yeah, I would, but my fiance goes at the same time. Yeah, no, I mean, it seems to be like an even more special virtue in a way because it's so counterintuitive to. It's very counterintuitive to me. You know, as just an idea, right? Of giving up control, of giving up security. It's the virtue of letting other people's virtue take care of you, as opposed to letting your own virtue take care of you. But there seems to be something, you know, about that very aspect of its nature as a virtue, which makes it more virtuous in a way. So just if you could speak a little bit to, you know, its kind of unique identity as a virtue that doesn't occur naturally, to my knowledge. Right.
No, yeah. I mean, so when I say the natural virtue of poverty, really it has its limits because if you're going to view it separately like that, like Marie Kondo and other minimalists, they're living very intentionally, and in that way, they're obtaining the habit of poverty, I guess.
They're making a lot of money.
But yes, that's what I'm saying. They're making a lot of money still. And it does come down to the economics for them. Like, they actually often are really focused on saving money and using their money instead of on things, using it on experiences or on, I don't know, I can't think of it, like business projects or whatever, which could be very noble and good too, but it still runs the risk of becoming its own kind of attachment, like to minimalism, which is, yeah. And I think that's where the divine comes in. Like, the whole point is that this is radical reliance on God's providence. And then, I don't know if this is really getting at what you're asking. I didn't think a ton about the magnanimous man in contrast to this, mostly just the habit aspect of virtues. So I don't think that Aristotle would agree with me all the way, but I think he would agree that in order to obtain this as a habit, we have to practice it. That's more what I meant.
Sure.
Nathan.
Okay, my question mostly has to do with, I'm wondering how essential this detachment from material wealth is to poverty of spirit, right? Because it's poverty of spirit, not poverty of, material things, right? So is this more of, does this poverty of spirit necessitate a detachment from material wealth? Or is it more an interior disposition?
I think it necessitates a detachment, but it doesn't necessarily necessitate like being financially completely without money. And we see examples of saints, like I said, of St. Thomas More, who was a very influential person in high power and had lots of wealth, but it's obvious that he had a really good disposition towards his money, and obvious in the way that he became a saint. I mean, his whole life is saintly, but that he was willing to give up everything, and that willingness isn't always tested. Some people are called to this greatness of wealth and status, and then it gets tested and they are able to give it all up, and that's like a proof of their sanctity. But I think as far as it goes for the people here, I think plenty of us could be called to a kind of greatness that you're arguing for in your oration, of even financial greatness, as long as you are always using your wealth to the greater glory of God, really. And that's easy. Again, the danger of that mentality is it's easy to really convince yourself that you're using your money to the greater glory of God. So really intentionally discerning that with prayer and whatever your methods are for discerning things, like making sure that when you are acquiring this money, you are acquiring it with the right intentions.
So then I could have a Maserati but be detached from it.
All right, we'll take one more question and then we'll wrap it up.
That's great.
That's a sandwich. All right. So I want to go back to the virtue of prudence, because it's the thing that ever since you wanted to write on the subject, it's always bothered me. I want to talk about the virtue. As you know, because you were there, we've gone through some of these. Some very radical times, like the U.S. government accidentally sent us money the day before we needed to make a mortgage payment. And then they sent a letter later and said, oh, you weren't supposed to have that, send it back. And an accountant said, we'll send it back. $50 a quarter till it's paid off. Like, all right, so that lasted a long time. I have seen the radical care in our family when we were that poor. I've also seen the difficulties, like on the other side, because sometimes I do kind of crazy, amazing things at work, and then there's too much money. Then there's the idea of prudence, like, well, did you put money away for retirement? And I think that's probably the single biggest thing I'm struggling with now. Things are going, I still got a lot of kids in college, life of poverty. That's how you live out poverty. Schools like that. But there is a virtue of prudence, but that's an Aristotelian virtue, not unlike magnanimity. I mean, there's prudence.
Can you say what your question is?
That's my question. How do you distinguish between what's prudent for putting money away and what's poverty? Like, I need to give it away or I need to save it. Because when you have enough to try to save it, it is suddenly a real struggle.
Isn't that the same? Like when you're deciding whether or not to put something away or to use it, isn't that a projected decision? Like, I mean, that is generally the decision you're making, is whether or not to use it on yourself or to use it on someone else or on something and like give it away. And when I say prudence, I more mean discernment, I think. I more mean like deep prayer. Like this needs to be taken to prayer. It's a part of our life and God's involved in all parts of our life. So any big decisions like that are worthy of prayer.
Good. I think we'll have to wrap it up there, but join me in thanking Ceclia.